We now continue with our good dead friend George Berkeley, looking more at his metaphysics. Now, as we saw way back at the start of Berkeley, that his goal was to restore faith and refute both the skeptics and the atheists. And some might see some irony in the way he defeats the skeptics, because he ends up presenting what is typically a skeptical nightmare scenario, at least nightmare for non-skeptics, in which there's just minds and ideas, and seemingly nothing out there. Now, he thinks that the rejection of matter is a good thing, because he believes that it helps him establish the existence of God, which takes care of those atheists. And so his reasoning is, to recap it a bit, is that if matter doesn't exist, then we will be led logically to accept the existence of God. So he's going to do this by looking at the cause of our ideas and believes that this will lead us to God. And so his project in some ways is similar to our good dead friend Descartes in his meditations. So what he's going to do is do kind of an argument by elimination in part. The idea of an argument by elimination, as we've seen previously, is that you present all the options there are, and then you eliminate them one by one until you're down to the final option, which, if those are all the options there are, and one of them must be the correct one, the one remaining would be the correct one. So it begins by eliminating ideas as the cause of ideas. And he asserts that all ideas are obviously inactive, they're inert. They have no power nor agency. Now, he's not talking about like the idea of something like justice or liberty or a better mousetrap. What he means is, the metaphysical idea. So he wouldn't be saying like the idea of justice, has no power, or the idea of like, freedom or equality have no power. He means the metaphysical ideas. They're inactive entities. So given this rather critical assumption, is that one idea cannot produce or alter another. So, proof. Well, his claim is the only proof you need is to observe your own ideas, that examining them will show they have no power or agency. And much like some other thinkers, he believes that since ideas exist only in the mind, there is nothing in them but what is perceived. And so, on his view, whenever you have an idea, you perceive all of it. So, the being of an idea, according to him at least, implies passiveness and inertness. It's impossible for an idea to do or cause anything. To use kind of a bad analogy, you can think of them kind of like just a collection of pictures just sitting there. I mean, yeah, you could say like pictures could, do things like you can see them, etc., and perceive them, but they don't actually, cause anything. So again, use the analogy, think of like just a bag of pictures. It's not doing anything. And so these ideas are like that. They don't have any power or agency in them, according to him at least. And again, to make sure this is clear, he doesn't mean ideas like the ideas of justice or freedom or equality. He means, the metaphysical ideas, that they do, they have no causal power, or so he claims. So he believes that ideas are out. So first contestant eliminated. Next, material substance. Could that be the cause of our ideas? Now, Berkeley believes he's already taken care of matter, that he's refuted the notion of matter, and so matter, material substance, is out. So our second contestant, at least according to Berkeley, is out. So what must cause our ideas? Well, Berkeley believes it must be a substance to cause our ideas. And he believes there's only two types of substance possible. So we have an argument by elimination, kind of within an argument by elimination. And he believes that he's shown to his satisfaction there is no material substance. So if the ideas must be caused by a substance, and there's only two types, material, immaterial, and there's no material, there must be immaterial substance or spirit that is causing our ideas, according to him. So he believes that he's eliminated it down to the cause of our ideas must be an incorporeal, immaterial, active substance, or spirit. He uses those terms pretty interchangeably. So what is a spirit for him? Well, a spirit for him is one simple, undivided, active being. So it has the capacity to perceive ideas, and in that way it's functioning as the understanding. As it produces or operates ideas, it is the will. But it doesn't believe these are separate things. So the spirit, as he says, is simple and undivided. So it's not like you have like a, understanding, chip, and then like a will chip. We're not, metaphorically speaking, we wouldn't be like a computer motherboard with all these separate chips and parts that do all this stuff. It would just be, as he says, one simple, undivided thing that just is able to do these different things. What might seem kind of odd, though, is that he claims that there can be no idea of a soul or spirit. Why? Well, he believed that all ideas are passive and inert. So, he thinks, they cannot represent what actually is capable of acting. So we can only perceive spirits by their effects. Yeah, in a way, this is kind of like, ghost-like in the, the horror movies where there's like a poltergeist or something or demon, and you don't see it, and you see its effects, moving things, etc. So the words will, soul, spirit don't stand for ideas, but for something different. He does claim, and we'll see more of this later, that we do have some notion of spirit and operations of the mind, as far as we understand those words. So, the active mind. As Berkeley notes, we can create ideas in our mind and change them as we see fit. He believes this shows that the mind is active, because we can do that. And so he does conclude that he is the cause of some of his ideas. So we've got this point. We have a immaterial substance must be the cause of ideas. Berkeley considers that his mind is, causing these ideas, so at least some of his ideas are caused by him. But what about ideas of sense? Well, he claims that ideas perceived by sense lack a dependence on his will. So when he opens his eyes, he cannot choose to see or determine what objects will be present. And he says similarly for the other senses. Now what he infers here is there must be another will or spirit to produce them. Now Descartes went through kind of similar reasoning. Descartes wondered, where does he get his ideas from? And he considered that perhaps he is the cause of all his ideas. It all comes from him, and he's all alone, in his skeptical, nightmare. But then he considers maybe he has ideas that are caused by something else. So if he can't be the cause of an idea, it must be caused by something else, so there must be something else. And Berkeley's using the same sort of reasoning. He's trying to find ideas that he cannot be the cause of. And he claims that these sensory ideas don't depend on his will, which is something Descartes considered. But Descartes rejected this because he considered that maybe he is the cause of it, he just doesn't realize it. But Berkeley just kind of uncritically accepts, it's got to be coming from something else. And given his view, since it has to be an immaterial substance, it's got to be another will or spirit producing them. So, how do we know about other spirits? Well, as he mentioned before, we don't have an idea of spirit, our own or others. We only know about their existence by their operations or ideas that they, cause in us. So when we perceive motions, changes, and combinations of ideas, that, according to Berkeley, tells him there are other spirits. And he believes, or seems to believe, he's solving what in epistemology is called the problem of other minds. And this is the problem of how do you know that there are other minds out there? And Berkeley kind of leaps right to a solution. Hey, you have these perceptions, there's got to be other minds causing them. Because the only thing that can cause these perceptions is other minds, so they got to exist. Now he takes this knowledge of other spirits to not be immediate, because you don't know them directly. The knowledge depends on the intervention of ideas, agents, or spirits distinct from him, and these are effects that he perceives or signs. So how does he get into God existing and not just there being just other spirits out there? What he advances is a version of the classic argument from design. And here's how it goes. Some things, he claims, are produced by humans. But, he says, it is evident that the works of nature are not produced by or dependent on the wills of men. So, there must be another spirit that causes them. Why? Well, he's argued that these things cannot exist on their own. Again, matter's out, he's eliminated that as a cause. And ideas are out, they can't cause other ideas. So, if the cause has to be a spirit, and it can't be a human spirit, it's got to be a non-human spirit. And so here's where he rolls out his version of the argument from design. So he says, if we consider the constant regularity, order, and concatenation of natural things, the magnificence, beauty, and perfection of the larger and the exquisite contrivance of the smaller parts of creation, if we consider the exact harmony and correspondence of the whole, if we consider the laws of pain and pleasure, the instincts or natural inclinations, appetites, and passions of animals, and attend to the meaning and import of the attributes, and here are the attributes, one, eternal, infinitely wise, good, and perfect. What shall we infer from all this? Well, according to Berkeley, then we shall clearly perceive they belong to the Spirit who works all in all, and by whom all things consist. Now, condensed down, this is again a standard argument from design. You look at the world, it's all orderly and stuff, everything works super well, there's a design, there can be no design without a designer, and this designer must be God. So essentially, a standard argument by design, just kind of put in Berkeley terms. Now he has another argument for God as well. He claims that God is known as certainly and immediately as any other mind or spirit distinct from ourselves. How so? Well, he goes even further here. He says not only, can we know God as easily as we can know other people, he claims that the existence of God is far more evident than the existence of other people. What's his reasoning? Well, what he claims is this. The effects of nature are infinitely more numerous and considerable than those of humans. So any mark denoting a human, or effect produced by humans, more strongly evinces God. So the idea is that anything you take as proof there are other people, he claims, this even more strongly proves that there is God. An interesting argument. So how does he develop this? Well, it takes an interesting approach. In affecting other persons, the will of a person has no object other than the motion of their limbs. And that such a motion should excite any idea in the mind of another depends wholly on God's will. So what is he saying there? Well, essentially what he's saying is this. The only thing that you can move is your own limbs, which are, by the way, are ideas as well. In order for you to create ideas in the minds of anyone else, well, the only way that can occur is on God's will. So Berkeley is essentially saying that everything you experience is proof of God. To use an analogy, probably a bad one, think of like talking to someone over the phone. You can push the buttons on your phone, yourself, but in order for that text or email to go to somebody else, there's got to be a service, to send it, or you got to be on Wi-Fi, but it's some type of service. And so you can think of God as being like your, phone service provider. And when you text, you can type that text, but it's not going anywhere without the phone service provider. And so if you get a text from someone else, that proves there is a phone service provider more so than it proves there's a person behind that. To use an analogy. Again, that's not Berkeley's. He died long before phones and stuff. And that's what he seems to be saying, that anytime you create an idea in someone else, that's all on God. And I use the analogy of, texting. For your text to go anywhere, there's got to be this service, and God in this analogy is like that phone service. And so he gets kind of poetic. He says, God alone is upholding all things by the word of his power and maintains interaction between spirits, by which they can perceive the existence of each other. This pure and clear light, which enlightens everyone, is invisible. And so his proof essentially is, if you have any ideas of anything else, that's proof that God exists. So to the degree you believe in other people, you must, according to him, believe even more in God. So, what else does God do in Berkeley's metaphysics? Well, God is the perceiver. Now, Berkeley has to address the problem of persistence. What is this? Well, according to our common sense view, and Berkeley claims to be the philosopher of common sense, objects do not disappear when people do not perceive them. Once we get to a certain age, pretty young, we get the notion of object, permanence. And we believe that, when we leave like our house or apartment or dorm room, that it's still there. That when you're not looking at, say, your car or looking inside like your backpack, that there's still stuff there. That doesn't just, vanish when you're not looking at it. So how does Berkeley solve this problem? Because, again, his view is that all there is ideas, and they don't exist unperceived. So if you're looking at like a car, if you're not looking inside at, say, the engine, there would seem to be no engine there, which seems weird. So he uses God to solve this. How so? Well, he claims that God creates ideas in our mind and also perceives these ideas. So when we're not perceiving something, God still perceives it. So literally, God is keeping the world in existence by perceiving it. Again, going back to that, tree falling in the forest doesn't make a sound, and the answer is it's always yes, because God is always there, according to Berkeley, to hear it. Otherwise, there would be no forest, there would be no tree. And so, according to Berkeley, you can be rest assured that when you're not looking, say, inside your backpack, or you don't have the hood to your car opened up, that the stuff in your backpack is still there, unless someone's taken it, and that your engine is still there, unless someone's taken it, because God is keeping an eye on it for you. Now, we also wanted to beat a version of Christianity called deism. Deism was a view some attributed to the people like Washington, Jefferson, etc., and it's the view that, works like this. Berkeley believed that the mechanistic worldview of deism doesn't reject God, but it leads to a God who isn't quite God enough. Specifically, this God of deism cannot inspire piety, faith and belief and worship of God, and cannot inspire morality. Now, the deists, they held the view that God created a well-ordered, mechanistic world, set it in motion, and then essentially walked away, left it alone. This is the view of God as the clockmaker. God builds this super complex world, winds it up, and just lets it go. And so, leaves us alone. Now, Berkeley considered that, bad. Maybe not as bad as atheism, but maybe worse, perhaps. So he wanted to refute that as well. Now, he believes that his proof refutes deism. Why? Well, given his view of God the perceiver, God is not just the creator of the world, but God is governing the world. He is always present. He's attentive to all our interests and motions, watches over all our conduct, takes care of our minutest actions and designs. According to him, informs, admonishes, and directs incessantly in a most evident and sensible manner. In other words, everything that occurs because God is perceiving it and making it happen. Because, again, given his view, all you can do is kind of create your own ideas, but in order for someone else to perceive, comparable ideas, God has got to be involved. Now, this does lead, of course, to a bit of a moral problem, because that means that, on the plus side, all the good things that happen, God's in on. So if you like do something really nice for someone, like you know, a friend of yours is down, so like you bring them some like donuts or ice cream or something, or whatever they happen to like, God would be involved in that. But of course, it also makes God an accomplished anything terrible, because given Berkeley's view, a person couldn't murder someone else without God being involved. So every crime that is committed, God would be an accomplice, which leads, of course, to the problem of evil, which is, you know, how do you reconcile, you know, God with all this evil? Because all he'd have to do is just, he could let the murderer try to murder all they want, but they would just be kind of like, you know, thinking murder in their mind, but they couldn't do anything. And so you do get into a bit of a problem of evil, well, a pretty huge problem of evil there. Berkeley didn't seem to see that as a problem, though. Now, there is a problem he does see potentially with God. Not like that God is a problem, but here's the problem. God is not a sensory quality, and Berkeley claims we can only have ideas of sensory qualities, and we cannot have ideas of spirits. And to his credit, Berkeley raises this pretty serious objection against himself. He has the character of Hylas, again, who's Berkeley's character he's writing, who is being critical of Berkeley's theory. So here's the dilemma put forth by the character of Hylas. So God is a spirit, and we cannot have ideas of spirits. So if we cannot have this idea of God, we cannot conceive it is possible that things should exist in his mind. And if we can conceive the mind of God without having an idea of it, then it would seem that matter is conceivable even without the existence of an idea of matter. And that's quite a harsh dilemma, because, you know, the first sort of result of the dilemma is that things could exist, you know, without God, you know, matter. And of course, the problem being that if we cannot have an idea of God, we can't conceive stuff about God. So, problem. Either we kind of like don't have God, or it would seem that we can have matter. Both are bad for Berkeley. So Berkeley replies back with Felonius. Again, that's Berkeley's other character who speaks for Berkeley. So Felonius, or Philonous, makes a distinction between ideas and notions, and asserts that you can't have an idea of your mind, but since each of us is directly aware of our own mental operations, we can each create a notion of our own mind through reflection. So I can know my mind even though I have no idea of it. And he believes from this he can make an analogical argument and infer that other minds exist. And then he can use this to get to the notion of a perfect mind, the mind of God. So essentially what he's doing here is trying to solve the problem of other minds, which is, you know, how do you know there are other minds? And he uses an analogical argument. I got a mind, I see other beings, apparently, and so they must be minds too. And then I can think of like a perfect mind and go, that's God. Now Hylas actually gives a pretty sharp reply. And again, this is Berkeley's own, you know, his own writing. So Hylas replies that given those principles put forth by, you know, that Berkeley endorses, saying to the character of Felonius, it should follow that you are only a system of floating ideas without any substance to support them. Why? Well, the experience of the operations is not an experience of a substance. So what he's essentially doing, the character of Hylas, again written by Berkeley, is essentially pushing Berkeley's own argument to its logical result. Namely, if you could have no idea of matter, so there's no material substance, then it would seem you can't have an idea of immaterial substance. All you can think of is there's just a bunch of ideas in a bundle. Now, Berkeley didn't seem to recognize this as a problem for some reason, even though he kind of clearly lays it out. But later, as we'll see when we look at our good dead friend David Hume, Hume later uses this exact same reasoning to argue that we probably don't have any reason, good reason at least, to believe in immaterial substance, because no matter how you look for it, you never find it. At least according to Hume. So, we now take a look at science and laws of nature. So Berkeley wants to accept science. And so how does he reconcile his metaphysics with the science of his time? Well, here's how he tries to do it. First, he begins by looking at his theory of causation and says this: this consistent, uniform working, which displays the goodness and wisdom of God, leads us to seek another cause. So perceiving certain sensory ideas, constantly followed by others, and knowing it is not our doing, we take one as causing the other. For example, when we see what he calls a certain round luminous figure, the sun, we perceive the idea of heat and conclude the sun causes the heat, which seems like a reasonable inference. But surprisingly, perhaps shockingly, he says this seemingly sensible thing is both absurd and unintelligible. So then, how does this work? Now, the reason why, of course, the sun cannot cause the heat and light is because for Berkeley, the sun is just an idea that can cause nothing. So how does science and religion get along? How does all this work? Well, he claims that science does not eliminate religion. Because, again, he wants science. He likes science. But he also, of course, likes religion more. But he so wants to reconcile them both, which is a thing people like Descartes and Locke and others tried to do. So how do we reconcile the two? Well, Berkeley claims we need God to explain the uniformity of events. Again, kind of a argument by design. So what about miracles? Well, he believes that miracles can be easily explained. In fact, in a way, everything is kind of a miracle. Because on his view, all natural events are directly caused by God. So he can, deviate from the usual order as he wills. In fact, in a way, there'd be no difference between a miracle and a non-miracle, except I guess miracles would be, again, kind of like outside the normal order of things. Now, Berkeley does rely a bit on a biblical argument. So Hylas argues that, Hylas is a character written by Berkeley that's critical of Berkeley's theory. So Hylas argues that Scripture states that God created the heavens and the earth, etc., but it doesn't say he created ideas. Philonius makes a reasonable reply. The Scriptures also do not state that God created matter. So he has to have his own interpretation of the Scriptures. You normally think of God creating physical objects, but Berkeley is right. If you read the Bible, it doesn't say that God created material entities in accord with Aristotelian theory of substance or anything like that. And so he says that God created all that we experience, but did not create matter. And there's no, he thinks, inconsistency between the story of creation and his own view. Now, what about time and space? Well, not surprisingly, since there's just minds and ideas, he rejects absolute time and absolute space, and he regards them as abstractions that do not refer to anything that exists. So space and time for him are relations between our experiences. So space refers to experiences of motion in all relations between ideas of bodies. And again, for him, there would be no space in the sense of, a three-dimensional, emptiness, because there is no three-dimensionality for him in terms of that we, normally think of. He also asserts that time refers to the experience of the succession of ideas in the mind. And he claims there can't be any motion other than relative, so that to conceive motion, there must be at least conceived two bodies, where the distance or position in regard to each other is varied. So kind of interesting view that, if there's only one entity, you really can't say it's moving, because motion, reasonable, is relative to something else. Of course, that does get into some interesting, conundrum. Suppose you had two objects moving away from each other, and then one ceased to be. Would the other one not be moving anymore? Kind of interesting question. Now, getting to gravity, he also wants to talk about gravity. and he claims that gravity and force are not metaphysical entities, but mathematical expressions of predictable relations between events. Now, much of what he said, as you might gather, had influence on thinkers later on. Now, obviously, Einstein didn't sit down and read Berkeley and go, space and time are relative, but the notion of relative space and time, we do see laid out here. Anyway, I don't want to attribute Einsteinian physics to Berkeley, obviously, but the notion of relativity, interesting point. Also, the idea that things are merely mathematical expressions of predictable relations between events also later was influential in later philosophy of science. Again, he didn't develop that much, but he probably laid in place some ideas. Now we turn to some problems and the impact of Berkeley. Now, one of the stock criticisms of our good dead friend Berkeley is that he's trapped in a trilemma. What's a trilemma here? Well, that is this, is that given Berkeley's view, it leads to one of three rather problematic views. And these are considered, two of them are considered like really bad. And one is not really bad, but bad for Berkeley. And these are solipsism, representative realism, and pantheism. Solipsism is the philosophical view that all that exists is my mind. That is to say, I'm the only thing in existence. This is often kind of a thing that people who are extreme skeptics, end up with. Like Descartes in his skeptical methodology, in his kind of bad but not worse scenario, he thinks that maybe it's just him. Everything else is a product of his own deranged mind. So, if all I can perceive are my own ideas, then the only evidence I have of anything is me. So it seemed to lead to solipsism. If all there are my own ideas, I can't get beyond them, then the best explanation for everything is it's just me. There's nothing else. Now, Berkeley does claim that God also perceives these objects, but critics have long argued that his view does end up collapsing into solipsism, because I just need my mind, ideas, and that would do it. Now, the way out, of course, would be to try to do what Berkeley thinks he did, which is find something that's causing ideas that's not me. Then I wouldn't be alone. Now, the reason why solipsism is a problem is because, well, the honest thing is that most philosophers consider it to be absurd. And this, of course, assumes there are other philosophers, because if you're the only one that exists, then I guess it wouldn't be absurd. But anyways, so that's the problem with solipsism. If all you can perceive is your own ideas, then the only thing you have evidence for is your existence, and then you're the only entity. Next, representative realism. Now, many philosophers, like our good dead friend John Locke, embrace this view and think it's great. But it's a potential problem for Berkeley, because if he ends up there, he doesn't want to be there. So Berkeley sometimes seems to indicate that ideas are specific representation of the ideas in God's mind, and that God's ideas are archetypes. Now, this seems to entail that reality, as it exists for God, is not the same as what we perceive. That is to say, there are God's ideas in God's mind, and then these cause ideas in our minds, and what's out there is not the same as what we've got in here. And this would seem to lead to a form, again, of representative realism. That is to say, our ideas are of things outside of our mind. So, potential problem. Also, of course, contrary to Berkeley, we wouldn't be directly experiencing reality, because we'd have ideas that would be caused by, archetypes in God's mind. So what we're experiencing wouldn't be, direct, the full reality. It'd just be our limited capacity there. And again, there are people who do hold exactly this view, representative realism. We don't, like for example, our good dead friend Kant, we don't have a complete understanding of everything. For Kant, there was a noumena, phenomena, etc. But for Berkeley, this would be a problem. And interestingly, for many philosophers, that their view leads to a view that's held by another philosopher that they dislike, not the philosopher with the view, that's a problem for their view. Third part of the trilemma is this: pantheism. So pantheism is a view that everything is God, that there's nothing other than God. Now, our good dead friend Spinoza accepted this. He argued that it's all God. We're all part of God. Not in any metaphorical sense. Literally, it's just God. I mean, there seem to be separate entities, but there are not. So, here's how the argument goes. If our ideas are not distinct from God's, then human minds somehow participate in the mind of God. In a way, we're sort of like ideas in God's mind. And so, there's just God and his ideas. And pantheism is generally regarded as like super weird and, crazy by almost everybody except for like Spinoza. And Berkeley probably wouldn't accept, pantheism. And so those are three stock criticisms. That his view leads to either solipsism, that I am the only thing that exists, or representative realism, that my mind is perceiving stuff, outside of it, and pantheism, that everything is God. And that would also be in a way a form of solipsism because they'd just be God. There are other problems with this view as well. One is with perceiving and conceiving. Berkeley claims, as we saw, that we cannot conceive of an object that exists unperceived. And his argument, critics say, does not prove that objects cannot exist unperceived. Berkeley, the criticism goes, takes perceiving and conceiving to be the same. He seems to think that we think in pictures and images. However, if we, follow, say, our good dead friend Descartes, it would seem we can conceive of something without perceiving or imaging it. That we have different ways of, thinking. That conceiving is not the same as perceiving. I mean, to use maybe a bad example, we can conceive of something that would be undetectable to our senses. We can make sense of that notion, that we'd not be able to, see it. Something that's invisible. And you can't picture it because it's invisible, but you can conceive of invisible entities. And, you can make sense of that. And so that seems to be a distinction between conceiving and perceiving. Although Berkeley might say, well, you're not really conceiving it because you're not really perceiving it. However that would work. Another potential problem with Berkeley, which I brought up before, is this notion of notion. Now, after Berkeley wrote the dialogues and rewrote the treatise, he added notions, the notion of notions. And the addition of notions does seem to create a problem in his philosophy. Because it would open the door for material substance. Because although if you buy his arguments, you can't have an idea of matter, but maybe you could have a notion of matter. So why does he bring in notion? Well, as we saw, he needs notion to allow us to have a concept of God. And if there are no notions, you can't have a concept of God. But as the standard criticism goes, if you have a notion of God, it would seem you could have a notion of matter. So, problem. Common sense. Now, Berkeley says he's a philosopher of common sense. And most people find it hard to accept this. Why? Well, if his arguments are not as great as he thinks, then simply saying there's external objects, the apple is not a bunch of ideas, it's, matter, that would seem to be a far simpler view. Ironically, it would be more like economical and would seem more sensible. And as I noted earlier, the problem of evil, since God essentially makes everything happen, because he explicitly says, trying to show the, kind of ironically, to prove God exists, he says if anything occurs, God's making that happen. I mean, again, that's fine when it's like nice things, like someone, giving you some pizza, for example, or someone being kind to you. But if it's something, awful, like someone, stealing your pizza, or someone, being mean to you, then, or you're going to really horrible things like people committing murder, etc., then that gives rise to the problem of evil. Now then, of course, theologians have been dealing with the problem of evil for a long time, so there may be a workaround there. Now, our good dead friend David Hume said of Berkeley that his arguments admit of no answer and produce no conviction. Their only effect is to cause momentary amazement, irresolution, and confusion. And Hume, as we'll see, definitely knows confusion. Now, even the theists did not really embrace his arguments, didn't see them as, decisive. So why do we still talk about the Berkeley? Well, he actually had a pretty huge impact. He raised very useful questions about the metaphysical assumptions of philosophers and scientists. He also, in his view, he showed where logic would take empiricism. And some take this as a refutation of empiricism. That sort of ironically, he says, here's where empiricism goes, and he thought it was, this is great, and critics would say, yeah, this pretty much shows that empiricism leads to just, absurdity, reductio ad absurdum. Now, some people do accept the consequences of his position. They say, yes, this is good stuff, and they accept phenomenalism. But some of them reject his metaphysics. Namely, they reject the, God and the idea of self. Also, as I kind of alluded to, his approach to philosophical methodology, language and perception, had a huge impact on later philosophers, so pretty important. And a form of his anti-Newtonian philosophy of science arose, as I alluded to before, in the 20th century. So, a pretty important figure, and, of course, everyone knows that if a tree falls in the forest, and that would be his greatest contribution to popular philosophy. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.